Good morning. I'm Mariah Bowen with the Louisiana State Medical Society. Today I had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Peter Marks with the Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Marks and I discussed the efficacy in the production of the COVID-19 vaccine. What follows is that interview. Thank you for watching. So good morning to everyone. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us today. And I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Peter Marks, who is the director at the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. As the director, Dr. Marks is responsible for overseeing the safety and effectiveness of biological products, which does include vaccinations. Dr. Marks received his graduate degree in cell and molecular biology and his medical degree at New York University. He completed an internal medicine residency and a hematology medical oncology fellowship at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, where he joined the attending staff as a clinician scientist and eventually served as the clinical director of hematology. After working in the pharmaceutical industry on the clinical development of hematology and oncology products, he did return to academic medicine at Yale University, where he led the adult leukemia services and served as the chief clinical officer at Smilow Cancer Hospital. He joined the FDA in 2012 as the deputy center director for CBER and became the center director in 2016. He is board certified in internal medicine, hematology, and medical oncology. And he is a fellow of the American College of Physicians. And we greatly appreciate you joining us today, Dr. Marks. We look forward to hearing your remarks. And I do have some questions for you following. Is there anything that I missed when I introduced you?
No, thanks. That was a very kind introduction. Thanks very much to everyone for listening today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so that I can show you some slides for the first portion of the talk, and then I'll look forward to answering questions. So what I'll tell you about are the three emergency use authorized COVID-19 vaccines that we have right now and some of the other information that's relevant. But I'll start by telling you a bit about how we came to have these vaccines and what it actually means to have an emergency use authorization. So normally vaccine development is highly de-risked. Companies do not want to waste resources on the development of vaccines. And so they usually proceed from one phase of development, for instance, initial phase 1 studies into phase 2 studies, and then into the studies needed for getting a license, the large phase 3 efficacy studies. They do those one step at a time, and there's usually months in between them of dead space. That means that normal vaccine development can actually go on for years. And often it's not until very late in the process that the manufacturers actually scale up the manufacturing process for the vaccine. So that means that it often is that at the time that the vaccine is launched, there's not a very large stockpile of that vaccine. Now, it's a very different story when there is a pandemic. Here, we needed a vaccine as quickly as we could. And because of the severe consequences of having economies shut down, people dying, et cetera, we needed to condense this as much as possible. And so instead of this approach with a lot of dead space in it, things were condensed. And for that matter, one of the trials, for instance, the Pfizer-BioNTech phase 1, 2, 3 trial was essentially all the different 3 phases condensed into one. While that was going on, there was a very significant scale up in the manufacturing process to a robust commercial process, and vaccine was produced at risk so that when the trial was done, if the trial showed that there was a safe and effective vaccine, there would be vaccine to distribute and inject into people's arms. And indeed, this turned out to work. It could have been that the vaccine wouldn't have been shown to be safe and effective and would have had to been thrown out. That would have been okay. But having that allowed things to proceed relatively rapidly last December, less than a year after initial attempts to create a vaccine occurred. Now, another question that some people have is what's the difference between a biologics license application and emergency use authorization? And to explain that, let's take a step back. Biologics license applications are how we approve vaccines in the United States. They're licensed under Section 351 of the Public Health Service Act as safe, pure, and potent. That's been going on since 1903 in the United States. We consider evidence from adequate and well-controlled trials, generally large randomized phase 3 trials, when we grant a license application. Now, after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, in order to ensure that potentially life-saving medical products were available to those who might be ill with a disease related to a chemical, biological, or radionuclear event, Congress gave the FDA authority in a public health emergency declared by the Secretary of Health and Human Services to make products available that were not yet approved when there was no approved and available alternative. This is because obviously if there was something out there that could potentially help someone with the disease and that entity couldn't be studied well enough because that disease entity wasn't usually around, that would be better than nothing. And so a standard for these types of products was that the products may be effective and that their known and potential benefits outweigh their known and potential risks. Now, if that sounds a little bit low of a bar for vaccines given to healthy people, you're not alone in thinking that. We realize that people generally want their vaccines to be documented to be safe and effective. And for that reason, although we use the emergency use authorization authority as a vehicle to make these vaccines available more quickly, we said in our guidance issued in October of 2020 that any authorization would be based on clear and compelling evidence of efficacy from large, well-designed phase 3 clinical trials. That sounds a lot like what I said about how we license vaccines, and that's not coincidental. It's because we wanted these trials to be very much like the trials that would allow us to license vaccines. Granted, you can't in a few months' time get the same 6 months to 1 year follow-up data that we would normally like to have for safety follow-up, but we did note that we wanted to see at least a median of 2 months of safety follow-up data on the population of individuals studied, and that's because the very large majority of adverse events with vaccines are seen within the first 2 months of administration. We also noted that the vaccines would have to be made with high quality manufacturing, that is, and that we wanted this to be as transparent a process as it could be, so that the public would have confidence in taking the vaccines, because we know of the issues with vaccine hesitancy. And we'll come back to that, I'm sure, because vaccine hesitancy is among the greatest challenges that we face today. In order to try to make sure that the public had confidence that we weren't missing anything by this accelerated timeline that we followed, we also have put in place enhanced post-deployment surveillance, safety surveillance, and I'll tell you more about that as well. So let's talk about the 3 emergency use authorized vaccines, as well as what's coming up in development. There are the 2 mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna vaccines. They are both 2-dose regimens given either 21 days apart for Pfizer, BioNTech, or 28 days apart for Moderna. Those have been authorized since December of 2020. And then in February of 2021, we authorized one of the non-replicating viral vectors, the human adenoviral vectored Janssen vaccine. There is another non-replicating viral vector vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, that's being used extensively around the globe. That's not yet authorized here. And then there are 2 protein subunit vaccines that are in advanced development, one from Novavax and one from Sanofi. And I would expect that we might see those come along later this year for some type of authorization or approval. So let's talk a little bit more about Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna, and Janssen. So all of those vaccines were studied, granted not head-to-head, but I'm showing them here next to each other just so you get an idea of the size of these trials. They had about 15,000 to 21,000 or so individuals who received the vaccine. That's very similar in size in terms of those receiving the vaccine to vaccines that we license. Generally, average licensure involves about 20,000 people receiving the vaccine. The demographics were such that we did better than we usually do in clinical trials. The number of Black African American or Hispanic Latino people enrolled in the trial were very close to the distribution in the population. And we had a fair number of individuals over age 65. That was not just by chance, that was because there was active work to make sure we had a distribution of individuals that mirrored those who were being affected by COVID-19 and mirrored the composition of our country. So the top line message on the efficacy of all three of these vaccines is all of them prevent hospitalization and death from COVID-19, and they do so essentially equally as well. There is possibly a little bit of a benefit in terms of milder forms of COVID-19 to the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna vaccines in return for the 2-dose regimen. It seems to be the case. Janssen, again, kind of a trade-off here. Janssen, one and done versus the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna 2 doses. That's an individual's choice to make. In terms of the safety profile of these vaccines, the major side effects tend to be seen and after the second dose, and they are generally relatively mild and go away within a day or two. They happen to be injection site pain, feeling tired, and flu-like symptoms. These have been seen generally more after that second dose, so it's probably wise to tell people after the second dose they may want to take it easy rather than having a strenuous day planned. Now, the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine has now also been authorized down to age 12 to 15. That was from a trial in 2,260 12 to 15-year-olds. And that trial involved a comparison also to 16 to 25-year-olds in terms of the immunogenicity of the vaccine and for the safety profile. You can see here again, equal number roughly of male and female participants and a reasonable demographic distribution. Importantly, the immune response in 12 to 15-year-olds was, if anything, better than in 16 to 25-year-olds, so no issues there. And the vaccine prevented COVID-19 in 1,005 12 to 15-year-olds who received the vaccine. There were no cases of COVID-19 compared to 16 cases that occurred in 978 12 to 15-year-olds who received the saline placebo. So the vaccine works in this population. And these 12 to 15-year-olds do get COVID-19. And although the death rate is nowhere near that in older individuals, we occasionally see deaths in 12 to 15-year-olds, and it would be nice to prevent them like we prevent other childhood illnesses. The safety in this population was very similar to the safety in 16 to 25-year-olds, and for that matter, in 25 to 55-year-olds, with, again, injection site pain, fatigue, and flu-like symptoms being most common. Now, we obviously are very concerned about safety monitoring here, and we want to make sure that people have confidence in these vaccines. So we've had an overlapping set of safety monitoring precautions in place. We've had passive safety reporting from physicians, patients, friends, anyone who cares to report in the vaccine adverse event reporting system, among other systems. And for active safety surveillance, where we go looking for adverse effects, the CDC has been using the Vaccine Safety Data Link, and FDA has been using both the CMS database for older individuals and the Sentinel BEST system, which is a claims-based and electronic health record-based database to look for about 15 outcomes of interest. That these are events that have been seen with other vaccines when they have been launched. To date, let's talk about what's been found. There have been a couple of safety signals. Very early with the launch of these vaccines, there was the finding of severe allergic reactions that occurred occasionally with the Pfizer-BioNTech or the Moderna vaccines. With the implementation of a mitigation strategy of asking people if they've had severe allergic reactions, particularly to injection medicines, and by having anaphylaxis kits available and watching people for 15 to 30 minutes after vaccination, this has now been really quite mitigated, and the incidence is probably on the order of 1 in 300,000, 1 in 350,000, which is slightly elevated above what one sees with some generic vaccine, but it's quite manageable. After the launch of the Janssen vaccine, the thrombosis thrombocytopenia syndrome was detected with that vaccine, as it was with the AstraZeneca vaccine. This is probably an autoimmune phenomena that occurs more commonly in women, and it's these rare blood clots, usually in places like the cerebral sinus vein, or in abdominal blood vessels associated with pretty severe thrombocytopenia. It's not just in 18 to 50-year-old women. It can also be seen outside of that age range as well as in men, but it's primarily, most of the cases have been, at least in the United States, in 18 to 50-year-old women. Because of this rare event, which seems to occur at about 1 in a million, or if you hone down the age range to 18 to 50 and confine it to women, it could be as high as 5 to 7 in a million. This is something we've added to the product label. Overall, CDC felt the benefit risk here, given that this is such a rare event, was still greatly in favor of continued use of the vaccine, and FDA agreed. Most recently, you've heard about the myocarditis signal with the Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna vaccines. That's been chest pain following vaccination, which has been associated sometimes with laboratory or imaging abnormalities or electrocardiographic abnormalities, primarily in younger males, ages 16 to 30. This association is still under investigation. It is also a relatively uncommon side effect. Cases have generally been quite mild, resolve on their own, and the benefit risk, again, is greatly in favor of vaccinating across the age spectrum, and we'll continue to follow these. Now, these vaccines have clearly been developed in less than a year, but without cutting corners. We've tried to use as public a process as possible. We'll continue to be as transparent as possible about safety signals. We'll continue to be as transparent as we can about getting everyone vaccinated. For those who are vaccinated, many are concerned about when we're going to have boosters. And I can say right now up front that we're still trying to figure out when that might be necessary. That comes from a combination of two things that will go into the decision. One will be how natural immunity wanes over time, and we're still not sure when that drop-off will actually lead to a significant decrease in vaccine effectiveness against preventing preventing COVID-19. And it also will depend on what variants are circulating in the country. Obviously, right now we have the Delta variant, but the current vaccines seem to do a pretty reasonable job preventing Delta variant. Hopefully we won't have further evolution to variants that are not as well covered by the vaccines. So ultimately, it's been our goal at FDA to try to make sure that we have safe, effective, high quality vaccines that people can trust and that people will get vaccinated with. And so I'll stop there, and I'll look forward to answering some questions now.
Thank you so much for the comments. And I do have a list of questions. And I think before I go to my list of questions, I mean, my family is the equal opportunity vaccinator, I guess. My daughter and I both have Pfizer. My husband got Moderna. My mother got Moderna. My sister got J&J. Which vaccine do you recommend? How do you recommend it? Is there one that's better than any of the others?
Yeah, I think it's really all up to what's available and what you choose. I think I think if the only thing I would say is if you're an 18 to 50-year-old woman, you might just be aware of the side effect with the Johnson & Johnson vaccines. Many people seem to not be too concerned because it's so rare and it's so much more convenient to get one shot. That vaccine doesn't have some of the issues with the that the mRNA vaccines have in terms of the amount of fatigue or flu-like symptoms. So I think it's really, I think it's been said by a number of people, but I would take whatever vaccine is available that you're comfortable taking. I don't think there's anything that's so head and shoulders above the rest for any one of the vaccines to say, oh, you shouldn't take that one. I think any of them that you can get your hands on or get into your arm, that's the one to take.
So the mRNA vaccinations, can you talk a little bit about how long those have been in use, how that's been developed, and why people should be comfortable having the mRNA vaccinations?
Right. So mRNA technology didn't come up. It didn't just first show up in 2020. mRNA technology has been around for a decade or more. And in people looking at making vaccines using the mRNA technology, it was used to try to make vaccines for other infectious diseases, including most recently Zika virus. And so we've had experience of mRNA vaccines in clinical trials. Now, granted, we don't have it. We never before now had an authorized or licensed mRNA vaccine, but we had experience following people over time against a variety of different infectious diseases in clinical trials. So we kind of knew what to expect for side effects, at least in small populations, and we were able to know that there don't seem to be any long-term effects of these vaccines in at least relatively small populations. So that was reassuring. We did know that these vaccines can be adjusted and adapted very rapidly, and that's what was so beneficial in this particular case, because within days of the sequence of SARS coronavirus 2 being available, there was an investigator at the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Barney Graham, who was able to already start to make the vaccine construct, and that's how this moved along so quickly. These mRNA vaccines are just really, I mean, what they're doing is just another method of getting the a protein from the virus expressed very briefly so that the body makes an immune response. And mRNA is a very labile substance. It does not stick around for a long time. So it gets in, does its thing, the cell degrades it. It has no chance of incorporating into DNA. Because first of all, it can't get into the nucleus of the cell where the DNA is. And even if it did, we don't have the enzyme in our bodies to take that back to make it into DNA. So these are pretty, it's really a pretty safe way of getting a vaccine in to get the protein so that the protein's expressed, and then we get the immune response, which allows us to be protected against COVID-19. And the immune response for these particular mRNA vaccines is pretty robust. That was probably the most surprising thing, was that I don't think if you would have asked me or any number of other infectious disease experts, they would have said, well, we think it'll be an okay vaccine, but we didn't think it was going to be quite as good with this kind of 95% efficacy. And we really probably would not have predicted that it was going to have 95% efficacy up to people in their 80s. I just recently looked over some data from individuals specifically in the 80-year-old age range, and they're making fantastic immune responses. So very lucky here that we have this to help protect the population.
Do you think that translates into becoming the way that future vaccines are produced?
It's a great question. I think for certain viruses, it probably will be. One of the things we've learned is that certain vector platforms seem to perform better for certain infectious diseases than others. So I suspect that this particular mRNA platform will use it as much as we can for viral infections that are susceptible to what this platform does. That's probably because certain vaccine platforms may help the body generate an immune response that's targeted towards certain pathogens, certain viruses more than others. But we'll probably be exploring that pretty extensively over the coming months to years as we try to make sure that we don't have another one of these pandemics anytime in the near future.
So obviously, since I'm with the State Medical Society, I believe that the majority of our viewers will be physicians, and I think they are all going through the same process of trying to determine how to make both patients and parents a lot more comfortable with vaccines. We've done fairly well in Louisiana, but I think we've sort of hit that brick wall of finding the people who are willing to take the vaccine. So with everything that's happening in the news, could you just comment a little bit on decisions that regarding pediatric patients, children, in light of what's going on in the United Kingdom and with the World Health Organization?
Right. So some people have looked at statements that have been made by other countries about vaccinating children, where, for instance, the World Health Organization made some statements that seem to indicate that maybe vaccinating children wasn't a high priority or wasn't a priority at all. And I think we have to separate some things out here. The World Health Organization is an organization that has to make recommendations not just for one country, but for everyone. And that means they make recommendations for low, middle, and high income countries. I don't think we want to hold our method of vaccination to their recommendations always, because it is true, if you're a lower middle income country where you have very few people vaccinated, your first priority would probably be to get older individuals vaccinated to decrease the number of deaths that are occurring. But I think in a country like the United States, our goal is to get back to normal, right? We want to stop having to wear masks. We want to be able to go out to bars, restaurants, movies, sports events, go shopping in the supermarket without being worried that we're going to come down with something. And to get there, we're going to need to have children vaccinated, because otherwise we're going to have a reservoir of this virus around that's going to be waiting to infect people. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to vaccinate those who can be. And right now, anyone over 12 and over can get vaccinated. I think it makes a lot of sense to do so. The United Kingdom has, they're special. Okay, I'm not gonna, they can decide what they need to decide there. Again, probably because of their public health priorities. But here in the United States, I think we recognize that we want to get people back to normal as much as they can. We also recognize that, far from causing no problems in kids, we know that since the beginning of the COVID epidemic, about 400 children have died under the age of 18. So, it says, you might say, well, 400 out of all these thousands and thousands, but no one should have to lose a child to an infectious disease that we can prevent. And since these vaccines have very modest side effects, it seems like it makes sense for us to get our kids vaccinated. The youngest children, we are going to wait till we have more safety data. So it probably won't be till late in the year at the earliest time that we'll be able to say, well, the less than 12-year-olds could get vaccinated. So they're still in the category of mask wearing and taking precautions. But for 12 and up, I think we're pretty confident that it's a good idea to vaccinate them.
And the long-term safety implications of those 12 to 15-year-olds.
Yeah, so right now there's no indication that there are any adverse, long-term adverse effects. There were some 12 to 15-year-olds vaccinated as early as almost a year ago in the first wave of the Pfizer trials. Those individuals are being followed. Nothing's come up there, but obviously we're going to have a large cohort of 12 to 15-year-olds that we're following using these safety surveillance systems. If we see anything, we're going to be honest about reporting it. But right now, we're not seeing anything that's coming up. And hopefully within a few months' time, we'll have even more data to hopefully put people's minds at ease about this myocarditis safety signal, which again, rare event, but doesn't seem to cause anything too significant.
With the with pediatric vaccinations in particular, a large number of those occur with the onset of school resuming, which could lead to a number of vaccinations occurring at the same time. Do you think that there is going to be a recommendation for these children who get vaccinations at that point with fall sports to take it easy for a little bit, sit out in light of some of the side effects? How do you balance that?
Yeah, you know, it's great. We've talked about that with CDC. There's no evidence right now that taking it easy is going to help prevent myocarditis. Probably getting kids vaccinated. I mean, honestly, if my kid was getting a mRNA vaccine, knowing how I felt having gotten those vaccines the day after, you know, I probably would not schedule them for their long distance run. Okay. I mean, just not because I was worried about myocarditis or that, but just because I know that I felt, you know, my symptoms after the vaccine, I don't know why. It wasn't so bad after the second dose for me, but after the first dose, boy, I felt like someone gave me a sleeping pill. I probably would just make sure I was prepared for the known side effects that occur, because they occur in the majority of those after the second dose. I would get the vaccine. So I'm not sure I would have specific rest for any of the side effects like myocarditis, other than just for the side effects, the general side effects we know with the vaccine.
Totally agree with you on the fatigue. I think that was the best sleep I got in a long time. I think I've slept for 24 hours. Would there be a consideration where adolescents only get one of the doses rather than both?
Yeah, great question. Right now, the concern about just giving them one of the doses is that we know after one of the doses, you are partially protected. We know that after one dose, you have probably about 65% protection against COVID-19. The problem is you really don't get well protected against the variants, particularly things like the Delta variant and the Delta plus variant. So we probably recommend that if you're going to vaccinate, do it right and get both of the doses. You know, we'll probably see more studies done and more data that will come out. But for right now, I would recommend we vaccinate according to the schedule.
And do you foresee boosters coming?
Really good question. Really good question. I suspect we'll be really looking to see if in the older population we need to give those at about a year or a year and a half, and we don't know for sure yet. And we're looking very careful at vaccine effectiveness to see if there's some tapering off of that. The government's ready to pull the trigger to give these, because the last thing we want to see is our vulnerable older folks in nursing homes starting to get sick from COVID-19 again. So if we have to pull the trigger and start vaccinating people at a year with boosters, we're ready to do so, and there'll be a supply of vaccine to be able to do so. On the other hand, we don't want to put people through the inconvenience of getting a shot that they don't need. So there's a bit of a balance here. Unfortunately, this is one of those that we're essentially building the plane a little bit while we're flying it. So we'll just have to see as we come into the fall. But we're ready to pull the trigger on giving those boosters so that there's a supply there to be ready to do so if we need to. And obviously, if the variants change drastically in the United States, so that we have variants of COVID-19 that the current vaccines don't cover well, we'll obviously have to think about boosters against those variants.
Do you think end up where they fall in line with you getting your flu shot every year, or at some point where they become a combination shot and you're only getting one?
So great question, because the vaccine manufacturers are already thinking about that. And so they'll probably be studied. In fact, their intention is to study them like this so that they could be given as either a combination vaccine or right on top of each other. Exactly. Because if they end up having to be a yearly vaccine, some of us are still, I may be a little bit an eternal optimist. I'm hoping that globally we all rise to the occasion, that people realize that we really have to get vaccinated, much as the same way as the world realized we had to get vaccinated against smallpox, and we've gotten vaccinated in the United States against polio to essentially drive it out of the country. I'm hoping we might get there so that we can finally get rid of this particular infectious disease. If that's made possible by the fact that we have such effective vaccines. We're not lucky enough to have such effective vaccines for flu yet. Hopefully, maybe we'll get there soon.
We've talked about pediatrics. We've talked about our older population. Let's talk about the childbearing age females. That seems to be an impediment in encouraging people to get vaccines.
Right. So I would say, basically, if you're past your first trimester of pregnancy, you should get vaccinated. It's very clear. And that's because we know that COVID-19 in pregnancy in the second and third trimester is bad. It creates pregnancy loss and it creates problems for mom. We also know that in the newborn, that there is a transplacental carriage of antibodies, so you can help protect a newborn as well. There seems to be no issues with breastfeeding following these vaccines. So I would say second or third trimester or postpartum, get vaccinated. No issues there. There are data now. There was a New England Journal paper that showed the first data on over 500 pregnancies, but the CDC has a registry of thousands of pregnancies. Nothing has turned up of concern at this point. And in fact, let's just flip it over. Some men, there's been some circulation of noise about men becoming less fertile because of the vaccine. A study was published just recently that shows that sperm counts do not decrease at all following vaccination. In fact, there was a trend that was probably just a fluke towards increased sperm counts. So that's not an issue.
And if you are just considering becoming pregnant in the next year, let's say,
that actually is how the trial was actually conducted. Just so you know, the trial was, unlike some trials which are conducted in women who are not planning to become pregnant, this trial was deliberately conducted in women of childbearing years who were not necessarily using contraception. So I think if you're a woman who's planning on becoming pregnant, you should go ahead and get vaccinated, because on the clinical trial, women did become pregnant at various times, and there was no issue there. And there seems to be no adverse effect on fertility has been detected. We do know if you get COVID-19, that's probably a bad thing. You're not likely to get pregnant while you're in the middle of COVID-19. So it's more important to prevent COVID-19. And so again, these vaccines have proven quite safe overall, and the benefits seem to greatly outweigh the risks given what we've seen of this pandemic.
We have, there are a number of people who can't get vaccinated for whatever medical condition. Are there any differences from the regular vaccination series that you would give versus COVID-19 that you would recommend to a patient they not receive a vaccine?
Yeah, the only individuals who I wouldn't give a vaccine to would be somebody who had a known allergy to one of the vaccine components. If someone had a polyethylene glycol allergy, probably you couldn't give them the mRNA vaccines, and you have to consider something else. But even immunocompromised individuals, it's not clear that the vaccine is useless. We know that even in people who have chronic lymphoid leukemia, they're able to mount a partial immune response, and many of those with solid tumors, even those on chemotherapy, as long as the vaccine's not given right on top of cytotoxic chemotherapy, in other words, it's given 1 to 2 weeks before, 1 to 2 weeks after, they're making pretty good antibody responses. So in general, probably a good idea to vaccinate. There's not a population that I would say you shouldn't vaccinate, except those who are allergic to the vaccine components.
The emergency use authorization, at what point do you foresee that being removed and it becoming fully FDA approved?
Yeah. We're working as fast as we can because we know that that's going to make a big difference. Our hope is that within a couple months, we'll see a fully licensed vaccine. I can't tell you exactly when, but we're working essentially as hard as we can, because we know that for many Americans, having the FDA seal of approval as opposed to this emergency use authorization will make a difference. And as I've told you, it's to us, we're pretty confident in these vaccines, but because it will hopefully make a difference. And it is true for some businesses, they may feel more comfortable asking for people to be vaccinated once there's an approved vaccine. We're going to work as quickly as we can to get there.
So we've seen, in particular in healthcare, where hospitals have mandated vaccinations and different aspects along those lines. We've not gotten there in Louisiana thus far. We've not seen anything along those specific orders from employers, but we have had legislation related to it, and it's the to mandate or not to mandate. Do you foresee any reasons in the future where that could become? I mean, we continue to encourage, but could a variant pop up that may end up finding us in a situation where public health means more than?
Yeah, I try not to get too involved in those questions.
I don't blame you. It's been my life for the last 3 months.
Yeah. I will say this, that we're seeing a lot of people concerned about this, because there's this balance here, right? And it is a natural tension that I try to stay in the middle here without going too far one way or the other, which is that there's this issue that we generally in the United States have always liked to have autonomy over our bodies. We do not like the federal government or any government coming and telling us what to do with our bodies. At the other side of things, we also have the public interest of not having certain communicable diseases coming around. Most states, for instance, don't let you just walk around if you want while you're coughing with tuberculosis, because it is a public health risk and it can harm people. So there is this balance here. My way of trying to get there, and that's why I'm actually grateful to have anyone listening today, is that let's try to do this by education. Let's try to get this by people wanting to get vaccines. I don't want to bring someone screaming and drag them screaming to get a vaccine when they don't want it. I'd like to hopefully be able to answer their questions, to realize that vaccines are just doing something that happens naturally all the time, right? When you're a kid and when you're an adult, you eat some dirt, it happens. You inhale a spore, your body makes an immune response, and these vaccines are just mimicking that process. The vaccines, this current batch of vaccines is thimerosal free. There is no preservative in them. That was always a concern, with some of the older vaccines, that there was mercury. There is no mercury preservative in these vaccines. We're trying to make it so that as many of the things that people might be concerned about are not there. So again, my way of trying to balance this between these two ways is by providing people with the information they need. And I think just continuing to answer questions and continuing to role model the best we can, which is that by vaccinating and getting vaccinated, we're helping to protect others in our, it's doing the right thing for ourselves, but also doing the right things for others in the community, so we don't pass along COVID to the person who's checking us out from the grocery store or taking our order for coffee in the morning.
So if you've had COVID and you've developed the antibodies, how long are those natural antibodies good for, and should you get the vaccine?
Yeah, so CDC has published some recommendations, and I'll quote those. You know, it probably it's you know for the first 90 days you're probably pretty well immune from COVID. After that, immunity does tend to tail off, and for whatever reason, the vaccine generates these responses against the spike protein gets you a more robust immune response, particularly against the variants. And so we are recommending that if you've had COVID-19, you don't have to run out tomorrow after you get better to get the vaccine, but within the first couple of months, you should get vaccinated. There is a question that's open to research, and I don't have the definitive answer, so I think it's left to medical judgment whether both vaccines, both doses of an mRNA vaccine are necessary or whether one would suffice. And that's being studied right now. A way to finesse this problem is to just get the J&J vaccine if you've had COVID before, because that's one and done, and you don't have to worry about thinking about whether it's you should get that second dose. But that's obviously a provider judgment call at this point.
So the misinformation, and I think this is applicable to all vaccines, but we're seeing an uptick in a lot of misinformation, primarily through social media, which for whatever reason, news outlets pick up as a firm, fast fact. How do you educate patients on the misinformation associated with what they see on the internet?
Yeah, so I really thank you for that question. We are seeing more misinformation than we've ever seen before. I've been around FDA for almost 10 years. And I've never seen, and I've been dealing with vaccine hesitancy and with what you might call the anti-vaccine movement for years. I've never seen as much misinformation flowing around. And also some of it's not even misinformation. Some of it is frankly flat out lies. Individuals who may have died of natural causes or of even suicide, who then are being labeled as, oh, the vaccine caused their death. And all sorts of everything in between, like everything from microbots in the microchips in the vaccine to all sorts of things about the vaccines making people infertile or impotent or other things. So I think we just have to realize that there are a lot of actors out there that they usually have some other gain, okay? Follow what their gain is. If you're a foreign country, you don't particularly want to see the United States being very strong by getting back on its feet. Certain foreign countries have to benefit from having the United States not have a strong economy. There are others who might be benefiting from selling their particular COVID panacea, like high dose vitamin C or vitamin D or something else. These are just, we need to get rid of these distractions and just realize that we need to just provide people with the facts that no one from FDA, and we shouldn't as doctors be saying there's no problems with these vaccines. There's nothing ever that happens with them, because we know that every medicine can have a side effect. But overall, these are very, very safe vaccines that have been given to hundreds of millions of individuals now safely. And they've transformed how we're going about our lives. So we need to continue to use these. I think help people understand that this misinformation, if we follow it, it could lead us down the path to having a fall where we have variants spreading like the Delta variant, and we're back into having partial or full lockdowns. We don't need that. We need to follow the truth here, which is that these are really safe and effective vaccines, and the benefit risk is greatly in favor of getting vaccinated. I think we just have to take each person, meet them on where they are with getting vaccinated and try to work through their concerns. I guess, again, this is not an official FDA position, but if someone said, look, I'll take one vaccine, but I don't want to get two vaccines, I'd meet them wherever I could, to get something's better than nothing. But and perhaps after they had one vaccine, they'd realize it wasn't so bad. I'll come back and get the other. So I think we meet people where we have to get there to get people vaccinated, because if we don't get enough people vaccinated, we are going to be susceptible here. You know, the issue with infectious disease is, unfortunately, you don't know who you've hurt most of the time, right? Except, you know, if you're not vaccinated and you bring something home, you're going to feel terrible, right? On the other hand, I think we can all do ourselves a favor as the larger community by getting vaccinated, and it will make a difference.
Okay, so my wrap up. What did I not ask you that you think I should have asked you? Or is there something out there that you feel like any of our viewers really need to know that's compelling?
Yeah, you know, I think what I would probably just say is that, you know, we are going to continue to experience problems with COVID if we don't get people vaccinated around the country, because we will continue to have the development of new variants. And the sooner we have enough people vaccinated that we contain this replication of the virus, the sooner we'll have fewer variants coming up, and these vaccines that we have will continue to be effective. So I think we really need to work with people to get them vaccinated. I think what my one thing that does seem to speak to at least some people is just sharing the fact that you've been vaccinated, that your family has been vaccinated, that you wouldn't hesitate to vaccinate your family can often make a difference to people.
Lead by example.
Exactly.
Got you. Dr. Peter Marks, I thank you so very much for joining us today, and I look forward to sending this information out into the great wide world.
Thanks so much for listening, and thank you to all the providers for everything they're doing to help care for people.